Today's story is The Magic Fish. There was once an old lady, and she was very poor, and she lived in a tiny cottage that nobody else wanted. It was sort of round and with one room, and she had an old sofa which was her bed by night, and a smelly old fire that always smoked and never burned very well. And her only friend was a black and white cat called Miss Mew. Oh, and the worst thing about this cottage was the only loo was in an old rickety shed at the end of the garden. Can you imagine going out to the end of the garden if it's snowing or muddy or windy just because you want the loo? Well, this old lady had to, winter and summer, night and morning, and she hated it. Well, one day she found a 50p coin in the road. Now, 50p might not sound like much, but to her it was riches. And she was so thrilled that she picked it up and she thought, what am I going to buy with this? Well, you can't buy much with 50p, not even in those days. But she lived near a lake, and she knew that about this time of day the fishermen came back with their catch, and sometimes if they'd got something that was a bit small or a bit battered, they'd sell it cheap. So she went down, and the men were pulling in their boats and offloading their catches. And she went up to the men in the first boat and said, "Have you got anything you'd sell me for 50p?" And the man just laughed and said, "Go away, old lady, we don't sell cheap stuff." So she went to the next boat and she asked the same question, and the man said, "Not really, sorry, love." And she was just about to go away feeling very sad, and a man got out of the third boat and he said, "I've got a very small fish, if it's any use, I'll sell you that for 50p. And she said, "Yes, please." And he put in her hand a little silver fish. It was about the same size as a goldfish that you might have in your tank. Well, she was a bit disappointed, but it was a fish. And she thought if she put some vegetables in with it, then Miss Mew might like the bones and the nasty bits. It's only really a mouthful each, if that. But she thanked the man, paid him, put the fish in her pocket because she didn't have anything to wrap it up with, and started to walk home. But as she walked, she heard, "Psst, psst, hey, you, put me back." She looked around and she was all on her own on the path. She couldn't see anybody else anywhere. So she walked on a bit further. And then in her apron pocket she felt this sort of wiggly feeling. She put her hand in her pocket and she realised the fish was still alive. And it was going... And then it said, "Hey, please, put me back." The old lady couldn't believe the fish was talking. But he said, "Please, my father is the king of all fishes, and I'm the prince. And if you put me back, I can grant you a wish, any wish you like." And the woman thought, well, he is a bit small to eat. And that 50p, well, it wasn't really mine in the first place, was it? And looked at the fish and looked at the lake and said, "Oh, go on then." And she took him back and very carefully laid the fish in the water. And it went splash, 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 and sent showers of sparkling silver bubbles up into the air. And the fish said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you so much for setting me free. What is your wish?" And the old woman thought for a minute and she said, "My cottage is very small and very tumble down, and I don't have much to eat. Could you perhaps smarten the cottage up a bit and, I don't know, perhaps improve my garden a bit so I could grow slightly better vegetables or something? I do go hungry sometimes and I'm often cold." And the little fish laughed and blew more silver bubbles and said, "Go home and you shall see what you shall see." And the old lady thought she ought to curtsy because the fish was the son of the king of all fish. And she trotted back to her house. And as she got closer, she blinked and she rubbed her eyes a bit and she thought, this isn't my house. And she looked around. She hadn't taken the wrong path. And she walked up the path, and there, instead of her funny little squashed round cottage, it was a pretty little place with a front door and a window either side, and roses growing up the front, and a newly thatched roof. And she thought, can this be my cottage? Could the fish have granted my wish? Could it have been true? And she opened the door and went in. And the room on the left was a pretty little sitting room, and there were pink cotton curtains, and there was a lovely little sofa, and it was comfy and bouncy, and there was a little table, and there was a lovely hearth with a fire that was burning merrily. And she went back to the other room, and that had blue curtains, and there was a real soft bed, a whole bed that was all her own. It was wonderful. And then she went, and there was a little back room, and it was a kitchen, and it had got a pretty little table and chair, and a little hearth with a proper fire on it, and there was a whole stack of dry wood next to it, and a sink with a tap. And joy of joys, she went out the back, and there was a little shower and a toilet and a sink. She couldn't believe it. And when she turned round and looked back in the kitchen, there was a proper dinner on the table, hot and fresh. And under the table was a bowl of cat food, and Miss Mew had already got her nose in it very happily. Well, ignoring the dinner, the old lady ran down the path back down to the lake, and she said, little fish, thank you so much." And the fish said, "It's a pleasure. You saved my life." And the old lady curtsied again and said, "Thank you." And the fish said, "If ever you're in need again, come down to the water's edge and say, 'Little fish, I need to make a wish.'" And the old lady said, "Thank you." And the little fish swam away. Well, she went back and she ate her dinner. She sat by her fire on her comfy sofa, and she made herself a cup of cocoa, and she was so comfy and so happy. And Miss Mew, the cat, sat on her lap and purred and sang to her. And that night she had the best night's sleep ever in her real bed. Well, time went on, and everybody looked at the house and said, "What happened to your old house?" And so the old lady told everybody, very happy with what the fish had done for her. And her friends said, "Why did you only wish for a cottage? You could have wished for a manor house and servants and gold." The old lady said, "No, I'm content with what I've got." But she looked around and she began to think perhaps she had been a bit daft. And her friends kept saying, "Go on, ask the fish for a manor house and servants and fine dresses." And so one day the old lady went down to the lake and she said, little fish, I'd like to make a wish." And there was a spray of silver bubbles. And then the little fish popped his head up and said, "What do you need, my dear?" And the old lady said, "The cottage you've given me is very nice, but could I have a manor house and some servants and some posh dresses?" And the little fish said, "If it would make you happy. Go home and you shall see what you shall see." And so the old lady walked back home, and there, where her cottage had been, there was a fine manor house, and it had servants who came to greet her, and they curtsied and bowed, and they escorted her into her fine sitting room, where there was a grand fireplace, and musicians playing music, and a fine dinner was set in front of her. And soon she became rather proud, and she sent Miss Mew down to the kitchen because she was only a scraggy stray she'd picked up, and she ordered 2 very posh pedigree cats with long pink fluffy fur. And they came and they looked very decorative, and they sat by the fire, but they didn't cuddle her and they didn't purr for her. In fact, they didn't like her much at all. They were far too busy admiring their whiskers and their ears and their fur. And the old lady looked around and thought, "This is rather nice, but I've been very stupid, really. What I should have wished for is a castle, and to be made queen of the whole world." And so she went down to the water's edge. little fish, she said, "come here at once." And the little fish swam up, and there was a shower of silver bubbles. And the little fish poked up his head and said, "Yes, what do you want?" And the old lady said, "I think somebody of my quality deserves to be queen of the whole world. I demand a castle, in fact 100 castles all across the world, and a big crown with diamonds and rubies in it. And I want to rule everybody, and I want everybody to call me queen." And the little fish looked very sadly at the old lady and said, "Go home, and you shall see what you shall see." And the lady turned round, and although a carriage had brought her down to the water's edge, now it was gone. So she stomped back to where her house used to be, and instead of a fine castle, there was just her little cottage. Furious, she walked in, but there by the fire was Miss Mew, purring. The old lady picked her up and sat by the fire and looked around and realised how silly she had been. So she put Miss Mew down, and for a second time that day she walked down to the lake's edge. Little fish, I'd like to make a wish." And the little fish appeared with a shower of silver sparkles and said, "What is it now?" And the old lady very humbly curtsied and said, "Little fish, I've been very stupid. I wanted to say thank you for giving me my cottage back. I don't deserve it. I've been very, very silly. And I'd like to make 2 wishes, please. One, that you never let me have another wish. Except for the second wish is that you and all the fish in this lake will be safe and happy." And the little fish flicked his silver tail and said, "I grant them both. Go well and go safely and be happy." And the old lady said, "Thank you, fish." And she almost ran back to her little cottage, and she sat by the fire, and she cuddled her cat and ate her supper, and realised she was very, very lucky and very, very blessed.